The royal palace of Seong rose from the mountains like a promise carved in stone, its wooden halls polished by centuries of footsteps, its curved rooftops bowing humbly to the sky. By day, it shimmered with order and ceremony. By night, it breathed secrets. Prince Seong-jin had not slept. He stood alone beneath the eaves of the western veranda, wrapped in a heavy silk robe embroidered with dragons that symbolized control, power, restraint, virtues he wore like borrowed clothes. Below him, the palace grounds lay still. Lanterns glowed softly, their light trembling in the mountain wind. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, marking another hour lost to wakefulness. This was not new. For years now, sleep had come only in fragments, like a visitor who knocked and left before the door could be opened. When Seong-jin closed his eyes, his body refused to rest. His thoughts raced. His blood felt hot. And beneath it all stirred something restless, demanding attention, demanding release. He pressed a hand to his chest and inhaled slowly, as the tutors had taught him in childhood. It did not help. The palace had given him everything: status, wealth, beauty, endless indulgence. Yet the more he consumed, the less satisfied he became. Pleasure faded quickly, leaving behind a sharper hunger. A craving that did not belong to one person or one desire, but to excess itself. Tonight, as on many nights, he felt watched. Not by guards. Not by servants. By something quieter. Something patient. In the lower quarters, far from the carved beams and silk screens, Amara folded garments by lamplight. Her hands moved carefully, as if the fabric might remember roughness. She had learned that stillness kept attention away, and attention, in this palace, was dangerous. She was foreign here. Her accent. Her skin. Her past. She belonged nowhere except to her duties, and even those could be taken away without warning. The palace never slept, but it listened. Amara paused, a strange pressure settling in her chest. The night felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself leaned inward. She had known this feeling before, long ago, when elders spoke of unseen forces that fed on imbalance, things drawn to desire left unchecked. She whispered a quiet prayer, one her grandmother had taught her, and returned to her work. Seong-jin walked the corridors without intention, his bare feet silent against the polished wood. Each turn felt familiar, yet wrong, as if the palace subtly rearranged itself at night. Shadows clung to corners longer than they should. Candle flames bent without wind. As he passed the servants' hall, a thin line of light escaped beneath a paper door. He stopped. Inside, someone moved. The sight unsettled him, not with desire alone, but with a strange sense of grounding, like stepping onto solid earth after drifting too long at sea. The hunger eased slightly, enough for him to notice its absence. That frightened him more than the hunger itself. He turned away sharply and continued down the corridor, jaw tight, pulse quickening. Calm felt like weakness. Calm invited reflection, and reflection led to guilt. In his chambers, he poured tea he did not drink and stared at scrolls he did not read. The wealth of kingdoms lay scattered around him like toys discarded by a bored child. Nothing held weight anymore. A thought surfaced, unbidden. You are losing control. He struck the table with his palm, the sound echoing too loudly. The candle flickered, casting a long, distorted shadow across the wall. For a brief instant, the shadow seemed to move on its own. Seong-jin turned away. At dawn, the palace awakened. Servants bowed. Ministers gathered. The prince emerged flawless, his expression composed, his posture regal. No one saw the exhaustion in his bones. Only the royal physician noticed the tremor in his hands. Your Highness, the physician said carefully, your pulse is restless. You must rest more. Seong-jin smiled, polite and distant. I will consider it. They both knew he would not. Later that morning, Amara carried water through the eastern corridor. The sun filtered through paper windows, warming the wood beneath her feet. She was focused on her steps when the presence reached her first, an instinctive warning. She lowered her gaze as footsteps approached and stopped. Your name, a man's voice said. She bowed deeply. Amara, your highness. Silence followed. Not cruel. Not kind. Measuring. You serve well, he said at last. Thank you, your highness. When he walked on, the air felt lighter, but her heart raced. She did not look up. She did not need to. Something had shifted. Prince Seong-jin continued down the corridor, unsettled by the brief exchange. The hunger stirred again, not violently, but attentively, as if awakened by recognition. Above them, the palace bells rang, carrying sound through stone and wood alike. And somewhere unseen, something older than the palace itself took notice. The palace had learned the prince's rhythms. By mid-morning, music echoed through the inner halls, soft strings, slow drums, melodies chosen not for tradition but for comfort. Incense burned longer than custom allowed, heavy with sweet notes meant to calm the nerves. Servants were dismissed more often. Doors closed more tightly. Prince Seong-jin no longer noticed these changes. They had become extensions of his body, responses to a need that dictated his days and devoured his nights. What began as indulgence had become routine. And routine, when left unchecked, became dependency. He sat before a bronze mirror as attendants adjusted his robes. His reflection stared back at him, still handsome, still regal, but thinner. His cheekbones cut sharper than before. His eyes, once steady, now carried a restlessness that no amount of luxury could disguise. You've lost weight, your highness, one attendant said softly, unable to hide concern. Seong-jin dismissed him with a flick of the hand. Hunger gnawed at him, not the hunger of food, but of sensation. It followed him from chamber to chamber, whispering promises of relief. The more he answered it, the louder it became. Satisfaction lasted minutes. The emptiness lingered for hours. He spent freely. Jewelry vanished from vaults. Silk and gold were given away as though weightless. Companions came and went like shadows, faces blurring together, laughter fading as soon as it arrived. Nothing stayed. Nothing filled the space inside him. From the servants' corridor, Amara watched the pattern unfold. She noticed how often the prince's chambers were sealed, how frequently incense smoke drifted beneath his door. She saw the strain on the faces of attendants who emerged afterward, eyes lowered, shoulders tight, silence clinging to them like damp cloth. The palace whispered. Amara did not listen, but she felt. Each night, the air grew heavier. Each morning, the prince looked more drained. The imbalance was no longer subtle. It pulsed through the palace like a sickness. She remembered her grandmother's warning, when desire is fed without restraint, it stops belonging to the one who feels it. Amara began to pray more often. One afternoon, rain pressed against the palace roofs, steady and relentless. Seong-jin met with advisors, but his focus fractured easily. Words blurred together. His hands shook when he reached for tea. Halfway through the meeting, a sudden dizziness struck him. The room tilted. For a brief moment, the whisper fell silent, and the absence terrified him. He excused himself abruptly. In the privacy of his chambers, he collapsed onto a low bench, breath shallow, heart racing. Sweat dampened his robes despite the cool air. For the first time, a thought surfaced that he could not dismiss. Something is wrong. The royal physician was summoned that evening. He took the prince's pulse in silence, his brow furrowing deeper with each breath counted. He examined Seong-jin's eyes, his hands, the tension held in his body. Your Highness, the physician said carefully, your strength is draining faster than it should. Your spirit is overstimulated and exhausted. You must rest. You must abstain from excess, of all kinds. Seong-jin laughed softly, though no humor reached his eyes. You speak as though desire were poison. The physician met his gaze. Too much of anything becomes so. Silence stretched between them. If you continue, the physician added, lowering his voice, your body will fail before your will does. Seong-jin dismissed him. But the words followed him long after the door closed. That night, the palace felt different. The shadows in Seong-jin's chambers seemed deeper, thicker. Candlelight warped across the walls, stretching his silhouette into something unfamiliar. The whisper returned, not gentle now, but insistent. Rest was offered, but only through surrender. He paced the room, hands clenched, fighting a battle that felt both internal and imposed. He wanted to stop. He truly did. But the urge felt larger than choice, heavier than resolve. When relief finally came, it was brief and hollow. Afterward, he lay still, staring at the ceiling, shame settling over him like ash. His chest ached. His body felt weaker. And yet, already, the hunger stirred again, impatient. Across the palace, Amara woke suddenly from sleep. Her heart raced. The air felt charged, as if struck by distant lightning. She rose quietly and lit a small candle, pulling from her belongings a thin cord woven with simple knots. She did not know why she was doing this. Only that her hands moved as though guided. She tied the cord into a charm, a symbol of balance, of restraint, of protection against forces that fed on excess. Whispering a prayer older than memory, she placed the charm near her doorway. Then, on impulse, she made a second one. She did not yet know where it belonged. At dawn, Seong-jin stood before the mirror again. His skin looked pale. His eyes were bloodshot. He barely recognized himself. For the first time, fear outweighed desire. But fear alone was not enough to break the chain. Outside, the palace bells rang, steady, unforgiving. And somewhere within the prince, the unseen presence tightened its grip, satisfied. By the third week, the palace could no longer pretend. Prince Seong-jin's decline had become visible even to those trained not to see. His robes hung looser on his frame. The sharpness in his face was no longer elegance but erosion. He moved as though carrying invisible weight, his steps slower, his breath shallow. Yet the hunger did not weaken. It grew sharper. More demanding. The mornings were the worst. He woke exhausted, as if sleep had drained him instead of restoring him. His limbs felt heavy, his chest tight. Sometimes his hands trembled when he tried to dress himself. Other times, a sudden wave of heat surged through him without warning, leaving him dizzy and disoriented. Still, when the whisper came, quiet but relentless, his resistance crumbled. Desire no longer felt like choice. It felt like command. The royal physician returned, summoned by worried ministers who had begun to notice the prince's absences. This time, he did not soften his words. "Your Highness," he said gravely, fingers pressed to Seong-jin's wrist, "your pulse is unstable. Your strength is draining at a dangerous rate. You must cease all excess immediately." Seong-jin looked away, jaw clenched. "You speak as though my body were not my own," he replied. The physician hesitated, then answered carefully. "That is precisely my concern." Silence filled the chamber. "If you continue," the physician added, voice low, "your body will collapse before your spirit understands what it has lost." Seong-jin dismissed him again. But this time, the warning lodged deep. That night, the palace seemed to breathe. Walls creaked softly. Paper screens shifted without wind. Shadows clung to the corners of Seong-jin's chamber, darker than the rest of the room, as if refusing the light. He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows resting on his knees, head bowed. "I want to stop," he whispered, to himself, to the room, to whatever listened. "I truly do." The whisper answered, not in words, but in sensation. A pressure behind his eyes. A pull in his chest. Relief dangled just out of reach, promised only through surrender. His body leaned forward before his mind agreed. When it was over, the silence felt louder than before. Seong-jin collapsed backward, chest heaving, vision blurred. Pain bloomed suddenly beneath his ribs, sharp and alarming. He pressed a hand there, panic rising. For the first time, his body had protested. Across the palace, Amara felt it. She woke abruptly, heart racing, breath caught in her throat. The air in her small room felt thick, charged, as though something unseen had passed through it moments before. She sat up and listened. The palace was quiet, but not peaceful. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, when desire feeds something darker, the darkness grows bold. Amara rose, lit a candle, and retrieved the charm she had woven days earlier. It was simple, cord, knots, intention. But it carried meaning, balance, restraint. She hesitated only a moment before slipping from her room. The corridor outside the prince's chambers was empty. Guards stood at a respectful distance, unaware of her presence as she moved softly along the wall. Amara's heart pounded with each step. She had no authority here. No protection. Only conviction. She knelt briefly beside the wooden pillar near the prince's door and tucked the charm carefully behind it, hidden from casual sight. "Let him rest," she whispered. "Let him be free." As she rose, a sudden chill swept through the corridor. The candle in her hand flickered violently. For a fraction of a second, she felt watched, not by guards, not by the prince, but by something vast and displeased. Amara did not run. She walked away calmly, though her legs shook beneath her. Inside his chamber, Seong-jin slept fitfully for the first time in days. Dreams flooded him, fragmented, heavy with symbolism. He stood in a vast hall lined with mirrors, each reflecting a thinner, weaker version of himself. Behind every reflection, a shadow loomed, growing larger as he shrank. He tried to turn away. The shadow followed. He woke with a gasp, chest burning, heart pounding. Sweat soaked his robes. The pain beneath his ribs returned, sharper now, forcing him to curl inward. For a brief moment, clarity cut through the fog. "This will kill me," he thought. Fear surged, real, undeniable. And for the first time, the hunger recoiled slightly, as if surprised. Morning brought no relief. Seong-jin struggled to stand during court. His vision blurred. A sudden weakness buckled his knees, forcing him to grip the arm of his throne. Murmurs rippled through the hall. He dismissed the gathering early, anger masking humiliation. Behind his closed doors, he stared at his reflection, barely recognizing the man before him. "I will stop," he said aloud, gripping the edge of the mirror. "I swear it." But even as he spoke, the whisper returned, soft, patient, certain. Promises had been broken before. Amara watched from a distance as the prince passed through the corridor later that day, his steps unsteady, his face drawn. Their eyes did not meet, but she felt the connection tighten, invisible and heavy. She knew now. This was no longer simple excess. Something else was feeding. And it would not release him willingly. The charm did not work the way Amara hoped. At first, there were signs of change. Prince Seong-jin slept longer the night it was placed. His breathing slowed. The violent restlessness that had clung to him like a second skin eased just enough for servants to notice. Word traveled quietly through the palace, perhaps the prince was recovering. But by the second night, something shifted. The air around his chambers grew colder. Candles burned unevenly, their flames bending toward the corners of the room as if drawn by gravity. The palace cats refused to pass the threshold. Guards stationed nearby complained of headaches and nausea but could not explain why. Inside, Seong-jin paced. The hunger had returned, not sharp, not desperate, but angry. It pressed against him like a living thing denied its meal. He tore through the room, ripping open screens, overturning tables, searching for a release he could not name. His thoughts felt crowded, no longer entirely his own. Images flickered behind his eyes, mirrors, shadows, endless corridors that looped back on themselves. "Enough," he growled, gripping his hair. "Leave me alone." The response came as a crushing weight in his chest. Pain flared suddenly, so intense it forced him to his knees. His vision darkened at the edges. For a terrifying moment, he thought his heart would simply stop. Instead, the pressure eased, just enough to keep him alive. Seong-jin understood then. It was not trying to kill him. Not yet. The following morning, the royal physician returned uninvited. He took one look at the prince and paled. "You ignored my warning," he said, no longer hiding his fear. Seong-jin laughed weakly. I tried to stop. The physician closed the chamber doors himself and lowered his voice. Then listen carefully. What is happening to you is not merely physical. Seong-jin stiffened. There are records, the physician continued, pulling a thin, dust-covered manuscript from his sleeve. Old cases. Princes, nobles, men of excess. Those who fed desire without restraint until desire ceased to belong to them. Seong-jin's throat tightened. What are you saying? I am saying, the physician replied, that something is feeding on you. Something born of indulgence and imbalance. The body weakens because the spirit is being consumed. Silence stretched between them. Can it be stopped? Seong-jin asked. The physician hesitated. Yes, he said at last. But not by medicine alone. Abstinence. Discipline. And separation from whatever binds the spirit. Seong-jin looked away. Separation felt impossible. Across the palace, Amara felt the failure of the charm like a sudden chill down her spine. She had sensed resistance before, but never hostility. That evening, as she passed near the prince's chambers, the air thickened around her. Her steps slowed, as though she moved through water. Her candle flame guttered violently. For an instant, she saw it. Not a form, no face, no limbs, but a distortion in the air, like heat rising from stone. It pulsed with impatience, coiled tightly around the prince's door. A warning pressed into her chest. Do not interfere. Amara swallowed her fear and kept walking. Fear, she knew, was what such things fed on. That night, the prince collapsed during court. The sound echoed through the hall, a sharp, unmistakable impact as his body struck the floor. Ministers froze. Servants rushed forward. The throne stood empty, looming and useless. Seong-jin was conscious but trembling, his breath shallow, his face ashen. Pain radiated through his chest and limbs, leaving him weak and disoriented. As he was carried from the hall, his gaze drifted, unfocused, until it found Amara standing at the far end of the corridor. Their eyes met. In that instant, clarity cut through the haze. Not desire. Not hunger. Recognition. Amara felt it too, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever bound him was not of her making. But she might be the only one who could still reach him. That night, alone and humbled, Seong-jin finally wept. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Tears slipped silently down his face as he sat on the floor of his chamber, back against the wall, body trembling. I want to stop, he whispered. I truly do. The whisper answered immediately, no longer subtle, no longer patient. The pressure returned, heavier than ever, squeezing his chest, flooding his thoughts with urgency. Relief hovered just out of reach, conditional and cruel. Seong-jin understood the bargain now. It would keep him alive. But only as long as he continued to feed it. Amara knelt in her room, both hands pressed together, breath steady despite the fear clawing at her ribs. She knew now that small charms were not enough. This was not a passing shadow. It was a parasite. And it was growing desperate. She rose and began preparing something stronger, something that would demand a choice, not comfort. Outside, the palace bells rang late into the night, their sound uneven, unsettled. And deep within Prince Seong-jin, the thing that fed tightened its hold, aware at last that it was being challenged. Prince Seong-jin made his decision at dawn. The collapse in court had stripped him of pride. The physician's words echoed in his head, heavy and unavoidable. For the first time since the hunger had claimed him, fear outweighed desire. Not fear of disgrace, but fear of disappearance. Of becoming nothing more than a vessel emptied by something that wore his urges like a mask. He ordered the doors of his chambers sealed. No music. No incense. No visitors. Food only when necessary. Silence above all else. Abstinence, he told himself. Discipline. Separation. The palace complied. By midday, the stillness felt unnatural. The quiet pressed in on him, amplifying every sound of his own body, his breath, his heartbeat, the faint tremor in his hands. Time stretched. Hours passed like days. Without indulgence to blur the edges, memories surfaced uninvited. He remembered his youth, the early praise, the unchecked freedoms, the way excess had been rewarded as proof of status. No one had taught him restraint. No one had said no. By evening, the hunger circled him like a patient animal. Night fell hard. Seong-jin sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, forcing his breath to slow. Pain flared behind his eyes, sharp and insistent. The whisper rose, not seductive now, but furious. "You are starving me." His chest tightened. His vision swam. A crushing pressure wrapped around his ribs, stealing air from his lungs. He gasped, falling forward onto his hands. "I won't," he rasped. "I won't feed you." The pain intensified. His body betrayed him, shaking, sweating, heart racing as though trying to escape his chest. Every instinct screamed for relief. The presence pressed closer, coiling through his thoughts, promising peace if he surrendered. Minutes blurred into agony. At the breaking point, when the room spun and darkness crept at the edges of his sight, the pressure suddenly eased, just enough to keep him conscious. The message was clear. It would punish refusal. But it would not let him die. Not yet. Across the palace, Amara felt the backlash like a blow. She staggered where she stood, breath knocked from her lungs, the air vibrating with hostility. Fear surged, but beneath it, certainty. The thing had been challenged. And it had answered. Amara did not wait for permission. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and moved through the corridors with purpose, heart pounding. The guards outside the prince's chambers stiffened when they saw her approach. "Stop," one said sharply. She bowed, then spoke with a steadiness that surprised even her. "He is dying." The guards hesitated, just long enough. Amara slipped past them and entered the chamber. Seong-jin lay collapsed on the floor, breath ragged, skin slick with sweat. His eyes fluttered open as she knelt beside him. "Why are you here?" he whispered. "Because you tried to stop," she replied softly. "And it punished you." His eyes widened. "You know." She nodded. "I've known for some time." Amara pulled from her sleeve a small bundle, charms woven tighter than before, marked with knots of restraint and balance. She placed them carefully around him, not touching, but close enough to press intention into the space. The air resisted. The room darkened, shadows thickening unnaturally. The pressure returned, heavy and enraged. Amara's ears rang. Her knees trembled. "This doesn't belong to you," she said aloud, voice shaking but firm. "You feed on what was taught to him. You survive because no one taught him restraint." The presence recoiled, not from fear, but from recognition. For a moment, Seong-jin felt something shift, like a knot loosening in his chest. And with it came memory. He was a boy again. A festival night. Laughter. Too much wine for someone so young. A whispered encouragement from elders who should have known better. Indulgence praised. Excess excused. "You are a prince," they had said. "Take what you want." The hunger had been planted then, watered, encouraged, applauded, until it grew into something that no longer needed permission. Tears streamed down his face. "I was taught this," he whispered. "I was never taught how to stop." The presence surged angrily, pressing down harder, desperate. Amara gasped, bracing herself. "Then you must choose," she said urgently. "Not comfort. Not relief. Choose loss. Choose pain if you want freedom." Seong-jin shook violently. His body screamed in protest. Every instinct begged him to surrender, to make the pain stop. He looked at Amara, really looked, and saw not desire, but resolve. Humanity. A life shaped by restraint, not excess. "I choose to suffer," he whispered. The room exploded with pressure. Then, silence. Seong-jin lost consciousness. When he woke, it was dawn. The pain had not vanished, but it was quieter. Distant. As though pushed back, not gone. His body felt weak, empty, but his mind was clear. Amara sat nearby, exhausted, her face pale. "It's not over," she said softly. "But it's wounded." Seong-jin closed his eyes, tears slipping free. For the first time in years, the hunger did not answer. Outside, the palace bells rang, slow, uncertain. The thing that fed had been denied. And it would not forgive easily. The silence did not last. For 2 days after the night of resistance, Prince Seong-jin remained calm, too calm. The hunger stayed distant, muted, as if retreating into the far corners of his body. He slept longer than he had in years. His thoughts were clearer. Even his breathing felt less strained. The palace whispered of recovery. But Amara did not trust quiet that came too easily. She felt it in the way the air trembled before dawn, in the sudden cold that clung to shaded corridors. Wounded things, she knew, did not flee. They waited. On the third morning, the retaliation began. Seong-jin woke with a sharp pain searing through his chest, violent enough to steal his breath. His hands shook uncontrollably. When he tried to stand, his legs failed him, sending him crashing back onto the bed. The hunger did not return as desire. It returned as punishment. Each refusal now brought agony, sudden surges of pain, crushing fatigue, moments where the world dimmed as if someone had turned down the light. His body had been used too long, pushed beyond recovery. The royal physician confirmed what Seong-jin already feared. "You have damaged yourself beyond what rest alone can repair," he said quietly. "Even if you never indulge again, your strength may not return." Seong-jin swallowed hard. "So stopping may still kill me." The physician did not lie. Yes. News traveled quickly. Ministers argued in hushed tones. The court grew tense. A weakened prince invited danger, political and personal. Some spoke of succession. Others questioned the wisdom of secrecy. And quietly, suspicion turned toward Amara. Why had she been seen near the prince's chambers? Why had his decline accelerated after her involvement? Guards were posted closer. Eyes followed her movements. The palace that had once ignored her now watched carefully. Amara understood what that meant. Protection had a cost. That night, the hunger struck back with intent. Seong-jin lay curled on the floor, pain racking his body, vision blurring. The pressure was relentless now, no bargaining, no promises. Just domination. "You wounded me," the presence pressed into him. "You will pay." He screamed, not in surrender, but in pain, and somewhere deep inside, something tore. A warmth spread through his chest, frightening and final. He thought, dimly, this is how it ends. Amara felt it instantly. The charm at her neck burned hot against her skin. She gasped, dropping to her knees as a wave of dread crashed over her. This was not another warning. This was an execution. She rose without hesitation and went to the only place she could. The old shrine. Hidden beyond the eastern gardens, the shrine predated the palace itself. Stone worn smooth by centuries. Symbols carved deep, meant not for comfort, but for containment. Amara knelt before it, breath shaking. "I will trade," she whispered. The air thickened. "I will bind myself," she continued. "If it will release him." The response came as a heavy stillness, waiting. Amara removed the final charm from her wrist, the one meant for her own protection, and placed it on the stone altar. She pressed her forehead to the ground and spoke the words she had been taught never to speak lightly. "I accept the cost." Back in the palace, Seong-jin's pain eased suddenly. Not vanished, but softened, like a blade withdrawn just enough to breathe. He gasped, clutching his chest, tears streaming down his face. The presence receded, furious but restrained, pulled elsewhere. He knew, without being told, that Amara had done something irreversible. By morning, she was gone. No farewell. No explanation. Only an empty room and a single cord left behind. The guards claimed ignorance. The ministers denied knowledge. But Seong-jin felt the truth settle heavily in his bones. She had sacrificed herself to buy him time. The physician confirmed it later, voice grave. Whatever was feeding on you has been diverted. Bound, partially. But such bindings do not come without consequence. Seong-jin stared at the cord in his trembling hands. For the first time, his recovery no longer mattered. The hunger remained weakened, but his body did not heal. He tired easily. His breath shortened. Pain lingered like an old injury that refused to fade. Abstinence became easier, not because he was stronger, but because his body could no longer answer the call. Each night, guilt replaced desire. Each morning, regret grew heavier. Far from the palace, Amara walked alone into the misted hills, the weight of something unseen settling around her like chains made of air. She felt no pain, only distance, as if part of her had been left behind. She did not look back. In the palace, Prince Seong-jin stood before the mirror and saw clearly now. Not a prince. A man who had learned too late. Outside, the bells rang low and uneven. Not for death, but for debt. And debts, once claimed, are never truly forgiven. The palace learned a new routine. Prince Seong-jin rose later now. He moved slowly, measuring each step, careful with his breath. Where once he strode through corridors without thought, he now paused at thresholds, listening to his body as though it were a stranger whose moods could not be trusted. The hunger no longer roared. That frightened him more than when it had. It lingered at a distance, watchful, patient, like an enemy that had learned the value of waiting. Physically, he did not recover. The physician spoke gently, but truthfully. Your strength has been spent, he said. You can preserve what remains, but you cannot reclaim what is gone. Seong-jin nodded. He had already accepted this. What he had not accepted was the emptiness left behind when desire withdrew. The palace felt vast and hollow. Music sounded thin. Incense made him nauseous. The mirror showed a man who had survived something, but not unscarred. At night, he dreamed of Amara. Not as she had last appeared, strong, determined, but as she was when she first arrived, quiet, steady, untouched by the hunger that had consumed him. In the dreams, she stood just beyond reach, separated by a veil of mist he could never cross. Each morning, he woke with the same thought. She paid for me. The truth came from the old monk. He arrived unannounced, staff tapping softly against the stone floors, eyes clouded but piercing. The guards did not stop him. Some instincts recognized authority older than rank. You live because another bears your burden, the monk said without preamble. Seong-jin bowed deeply. Tell me how to undo it. The monk shook his head. Bindings forged by choice cannot be undone by regret. He explained then, carefully, mercilessly. Amara had not destroyed the presence. She had redirected it, bound part of its hunger to herself, drawing its attention away from the prince. Such bindings weakened the feeder, but anchored it to the binder's life. She walks now with a shadow that is not hers, the monk said. It will drain her slowly, quietly. Seong-jin felt something break inside his chest, not pain, but collapse. Where is she? He demanded. The monk's gaze softened. Far enough that you cannot reach her without consequence. That night, the hunger moved again. Not as craving. As suggestion. Seong-jin sat alone, staring at the cord Amara had left behind. The room was still. Too still. The whisper returned, not urgent, not cruel. She weakens because you resist. His breath caught. Feed me, it pressed gently, and I will release her. The bargain was laid bare. Seong-jin trembled, gripping the cord until his knuckles whitened. The temptation was not pleasure now, it was rescue. Guilt sharpened the offer, making it almost unbearable. He understood the strategy. It no longer needed his weakness. It needed his love. Days passed in quiet torment. Each refusal brought a distant echo of pain, not in his body, but in his thoughts. He imagined Amara growing tired, stumbling, the weight of the binding pulling at her spirit. The hunger did not show him images. It did not need to. His mind supplied them readily. The court noticed his withdrawal. Ministers urged him to conserve strength, to think of legacy, of duty. He listened politely and ignored them all. At night, he spoke aloud, to the room, to the silence, to the unseen presence. "I will not trade her life for my comfort," he said again and again. The whisper did not argue. It waited. One evening, the physician brought troubling news. "Your heart is strained," he said quietly. "Another collapse could be fatal." Seong-jin smiled faintly. "Then I will avoid excess." The physician hesitated. "I do not mean indulgence. I mean emotion. Stress. Guilt." Seong-jin laughed softly, without humor. "How does one avoid those?" The dreams changed. He dreamed of corridors without end, doors opening onto empty rooms. In the distance, he heard Amara's voice, not calling for help, but humming softly, as she had when folding linens. The sound faded the closer he came. Each time, he woke with tears on his face. The hunger fed on this restraint in a way he had not expected, growing cunning, not stronger. It pressed less. It spoke rarely. It conserved itself. Seong-jin realized then that the final battle would not be loud. It would be quiet. On the 7th night since the monk's visit, Seong-jin rose from his bed and dressed himself carefully. He tied his robe with deliberate hands and placed the cord around his wrist. He went to the shrine. Kneeling before the stone altar, he bowed deeply, lower than custom required. "I cannot undo what she has done," he said aloud. "But I can choose how this ends." The air thickened, not with anger, but attention. "I will not feed you," he continued, voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "Not for pleasure. Not for relief. Not even for mercy." The hunger stirred, sensing finality. Seong-jin pressed his forehead to the cold stone. "If someone must pay," he whispered, "let it be me." Far away, Amara paused mid-step. The weight around her chest eased, just slightly. She did not know why. Only that the night felt different. Back at the palace, the bells rang once, low and deliberate. Prince Seong-jin remained kneeling, breath shallow, body fragile, resolve unbroken. The hunger waited. And so did the end. The hunger changed its tone. Where it once pressed and punished, it now persuaded. Prince Seong-jin felt it in the subtle ways the palace seemed to soften around him, the hush of the corridors, the gentler fall of lantern light, the faint easing of pain in his chest when he remained still. It offered comfort without asking, a careful kindness that unsettled him more than cruelty ever had. Kindness demanded trust. He did not give it. Days passed with measured calm. Seong-jin conserved his strength, avoiding court whenever possible, listening more than he spoke. The physician watched him closely, noting the pallor of his skin, the shallowness of his breath. "You are standing at the edge," the physician warned. "Your heart cannot endure much more strain." Seong-jin nodded. He had already accepted this. What he could not accept was the thought that his refusal might be hurting Amara. The monk's words returned to him often, echoing in the quiet hours, "The feeder grows cunning when denied." At night, the hunger spoke again, soft, careful, almost reasonable. "You have proven your resolve," it seemed to say. "One act will not undo it." Seong-jin tightened his grip on the cord at his wrist and breathed through the pain that followed the thought. The visions began the next evening. Not dreams, waking impressions that drifted at the edges of his sight. He glimpsed a narrow road winding through misted hills. A solitary figure walked it slowly, shoulders bowed beneath an unseen weight. Amara. The sight struck him with such force that his knees buckled. He caught himself on a pillar, heart racing, breath ragged. "She weakens," the hunger murmured, almost regretful. "I can ease her burden." Seong-jin's resolve wavered, not from desire, but from fear. The presence felt his hesitation and pressed closer, careful not to overwhelm him. "You do not need to return to excess," it coaxed. "Just enough to remind your body how to survive. Enough to anchor me here, away from her." The bargain sharpened. He sought the old monk at once. The monk listened in silence, then shook his head slowly. "It lies by omission," he said. "It will not leave her. It will simply feed more safely." Seong-jin bowed deeply. "Then how do I end this?" The monk's eyes softened with pity. "By refusing the bargain entirely. Even if it costs you what remains." The words settled heavily between them. That night, the palace grew restless. Wind rattled paper screens. Candles guttered without cause. Guards reported a sense of pressure in the air, as if the building itself strained against its foundations. Seong-jin remained in his chamber, seated on the floor, spine straight despite the tremor in his hands. He focused on his breath, counting slowly, grounding himself in discipline learned too late. The hunger pressed closer than it ever had. "You are dying," it whispered, not unkindly. "Let me keep you alive. Let me save her." Seong-jin closed his eyes. In the darkness, he remembered the first calm he had felt in years, the quiet that followed his refusal, brief and fragile but real. He remembered Amara's steady presence, the strength that came not from indulgence, but restraint. "I will not trade lives," he said aloud. "Not mine. Not hers." The pressure surged violently, slamming into his chest like a wave against stone. Pain exploded beneath his ribs, stealing his breath. His vision narrowed to a pinprick of light. He fell forward, palms striking the floor. Far from the palace, Amara staggered. The road blurred beneath her feet as a sudden weakness seized her legs. She dropped to one knee, chest burning, breath shallow. The weight around her tightened, then eased, as though something had been yanked back violently. She did not understand what had changed. Only that the night felt sharper, colder. In the palace, Seong-jin lay curled on the floor, gasping for air. Each breath came with effort now, his heart pounding irregularly, dangerously. The hunger hovered, furious and desperate. "You will die," it pressed. "And I will remain." Seong-jin smiled faintly through the pain. "Then you will starve," he whispered. The pressure spiked one final time, then fractured, as though striking a wall it could not pass. The presence recoiled, wounded more deeply than before, its hold on him slipping. But the damage was done. The physician arrived too late to change the course, only to bear witness. He knelt beside the prince, fingers trembling at his pulse. "Stay with me," he urged softly. Seong-jin's gaze drifted toward the window, where dawn began to pale the sky. Light spilled across the floor, gentle and forgiving. "I think," he said quietly, "this is enough." His breathing slowed. The pain eased, not because the hunger relented, but because his body no longer fought. In that stillness, clarity bloomed. Far away, Amara felt the weight lift suddenly, fully, finally. She gasped, collapsing forward as tears streamed down her face, unsure why relief had come, only that it had. She whispered a name she had never spoken aloud. Back at the palace, the bells rang, measured and solemn. Prince Seong-jin did not move. The hunger lingered at the edges of the room, wounded and diminished, no longer anchored to a willing host. It had been denied. And denial, at last, had won. Dawn broke slowly over Gyeongseong, pale light seeping into the palace as if unsure it was welcome. The bells rang again, this time not as warning, not as ritual, but as confirmation. Prince Seong-jin was dead. Servants moved through the corridors with lowered eyes and hushed steps. Silk screens were drawn. Incense burned not for comfort, but for mourning. The throne room stood empty, its grandeur suddenly excessive, its silence accusatory. No proclamation could soften the truth. The prince had not been taken by war. Not by poison. Not by betrayal. He had been consumed, quietly, by what no one had named in time. The royal physician stood beside the body long after others had left. He examined what could be examined, though he already knew the outcome. The heart had failed. The body, exhausted beyond repair, had simply stopped answering. There was restraint at the end, he murmured to himself. Too late for the flesh, but not the spirit. He closed the prince's eyes gently. Words spread beyond the palace walls by noon. Some mourned sincerely. Others mourned the future they had lost, the alliances unmade, the power unsettled. Ministers convened behind closed doors, voices tight with urgency. Succession was discussed in careful terms, as if speaking too plainly might summon more tragedy. And beneath it all, fear lingered. Because something about the prince's death felt unfinished. In the quiet hours that followed, the palace began to change. Cats returned to the corridors they had avoided. Candles burned steadily. The air felt lighter, not peaceful, but released, like a storm that had finally passed. The hunger was gone. Not destroyed, but unanchored. The old monk sensed it at once. It has withdrawn, he said quietly when summoned. Wounded. Weakened. It will seek elsewhere in time, but it will not return here soon. The ministers asked what that meant. The monk answered honestly. That denial starves even ancient things. At dusk, Amara returned. She walked through the palace gates unchallenged, though no one had announced her arrival. The guards stared, uncertain, recognizing her without understanding why. She looked thinner. Older. But the weight that once clung to her was gone. She felt the absence the moment she crossed the threshold. The palace was quiet in a way it had never been. Too quiet. Amara stopped in the courtyard, heart pounding, dread blooming in her chest. She did not need to be told. The truth settled into her bones with devastating clarity. She bowed her head and whispered a prayer, not of guilt, not of anger, but of release. Inside the morning chamber, she stood alone before Seong-jin's body. He looked peaceful now, free of the tension that had carved itself into his features and life. His hands were folded neatly, the cord she had left resting against his wrist. Amara knelt. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she spoke. You chose the harder ending, she whispered. You chose it alone. Tears slipped down her face, falling soundlessly onto the floor. She did not reach out. Some boundaries remained, even now. I wanted to save you, she continued. But you saved me. The realization cut deeper than grief. The monk watched from a distance, understanding more than most. When Amara rose, he approached her carefully. The binding is gone, he said. You are free. She nodded, though the word felt strange in her mouth. At a cost. All freedom is, the monk replied. She asked then, will it come back? He considered. Hunger always seeks a host. But this place has learned restraint. That matters. Amara exhaled slowly. That night, the palace held vigil. Lanterns lined the corridors. Prayers were offered. Stories were whispered, some kind, some honest, some long overdue. For the first time, the prince was spoken of not as an icon, but as a man. A man shaped by indulgence. A man undone by silence. A man redeemed, in the end, by refusal. Outside, the wind carried the sound of bells into the hills. In the early hours before dawn, Amara stood at the shrine beyond the eastern gardens. She placed the final charm on the stone altar, the last thread of a bond that no longer existed. I release what remains, she said softly. The air stirred gently, as if acknowledging her words. She did not look back when she left. By morning, preparations began for burial. The throne room remained empty, sunlight spilling across polished floors where power once sat unquestioned. The palace would endure. It always did. But something fundamental had shifted. Restraint had been learned. Too late for one man, but not for the world he left behind. And far beyond the palace walls, in places unnamed, something wounded and ancient waited. Weaker than before. hungry, and wary of those who had learned the cost of feeding it. The burial took place beneath a sky washed clean by rain. Monks chanted softly as Prince Seong-jin was laid to rest, their voices steady and unadorned. No banners of triumph were raised. No grand speeches followed. The palace observed restraint, at last, understanding that excess had been part of the tragedy. The earth closed gently over the coffin. And with it, a chapter ended. In the days that followed, the palace changed its habits. Incense burned sparingly. Music returned only at sunrise and sunset. Doors remained open more often than closed. Servants were given rest. Ministers spoke more plainly. The throne remained empty while decisions were weighed with care. Restraint was no longer weakness. It was policy. The old monk stayed long enough to ensure the balance held. He walked the corridors, listening to the building itself, tapping stone with his staff, murmuring prayers meant not to summon, but to settle. The hunger will wander, he told the ministers. But it will remember this place. Denial leaves a mark. They asked what that meant. He answered simply, it will think twice. Amara prepared to leave before dawn. She packed lightly, no mementos, no indulgence in memory. The cord she had woven remained at the shrine, its purpose fulfilled. She paused at the threshold of the servants' quarters and breathed in the quiet. For the first time since she arrived, the palace did not watch her. It let her go. As she crossed the eastern garden, the air felt clear, unburdened. The weight that had once pressed at her chest was gone completely. Freedom did not feel triumphant. It felt calm. Earned. At the gate, she stopped and turned once, just once, toward the palace roofs curving against the morning sky. Rest, she whispered. All of you. Then she walked on. The physician returned to his work with a steadier hand. He ordered records rewritten, not to erase the prince's indulgence, but to name it honestly. Excess was no longer coded as vitality. Silence was no longer mistaken for peace. Training changed. Young nobles were taught discipline alongside privilege. When asked why, the physician answered, because bodies remember what spirits deny. At night, the palace slept. Not perfectly. Not forever. But enough. Sometimes, in the quietest hours, a draft would stir a candle or a shadow would lengthen oddly along a wall. The monk said this was natural. Wounds leave echoes, he explained. But echoes fade. And they did. Far from Seong, the hunger drifted. Wounded. Wary. It sought warmth and balance, the familiar pull of unchecked want, but found resistance where once there had been welcome. People had learned to name it. To refuse it. To understand that desire, left unexamined, becomes a door. And doors can be closed. In a village by the hills, Amara found work that asked little and gave enough. She slept deeply. She woke without fear. When memories came, they arrived softly and left without command. Sometimes she dreamed of corridors and bells, of a man kneeling at a shrine with resolve carved into his breath. In those dreams, he was not hungry. He was still. She would wake with tears and gratitude. Years later, travelers told a story. They spoke of a prince who had everything and lost himself to wanting. Of a palace that learned too late. Of a woman who chose balance when the world demanded surrender. The story changed with each telling, as stories do. But one truth remained. That denial, real denial, was not emptiness. It was protection. At the old shrine beyond the eastern gardens, moss crept higher over stone. The altar remained simple, unadorned. When the wind passed through the trees, it carried no whisper, only leaves brushing leaves, a sound like breath returning to itself. The bells rang at dawn. Not in warning. Not in mourning. But as reminder. Some hungers can be fed until they own you. Others can be starved, if you are willing to pay the cost. Prince Seong-jin paid it. Amara lived it. And the palace remembered.